Let us bow our heads and put ourselves in the presence of the Lord. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for gathering all of us today. May you bestow your guidance and blessings so that we can enjoy and appreciate its significance in our lives. Bless everyone who are present here today, that each one of us may be able to share our knowledge, understanding, and wisdom for your glory and honor. May the various activities related to this event be a success through your intervention. We all ask of this in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen.
Good afternoon, everyone. The topic that we are going to discuss this afternoon is all about Chapter 2, Content and Contextual Analysis of Selected Primary Sources in the Philippine History. And for the learning objectives of this chapter, the students are expected to familiarize oneself with the primary documents in different historical periods of the Philippines, to learn history through primary sources, to properly interpret primary sources through examining the content and context of the document, and to understand the context behind each selected document. The last chapter discusses the importance of familiarizing oneself with the different kinds of historical sources. The historian's primary tools to understand and interpret the past are historical sources. Historical sources are facts that are analyzed and interpreted by historians to weave the historical narrative. Historians who study historical subjects and events need to use various primary sources to weave the narrative. Primary sources, as discussed in the last chapter, consist of documents, memoirs, accounts, and other materials that were produced during the period of the events or subject being studied. The last chapter also discussed that using primary sources in historical research has two kinds of criticism. First is the external criticism, and the second one is the internal criticism. External criticism examines the authenticity of the document or evidence to be used to ensure that the primary sources are not fabricated, while internal criticism means the truthfulness of the evidence. This criticism requires not just the act of establishing truthfulness and/or accuracy, but also the examination of the primary sources in terms of the context of its production. It should be recognized that facts neither exist in a vacuum nor are produced from the blank slate. These are products of the time and the people. In this chapter, we are going to look at several primary sources from different historical periods and evaluate those documents' contents in terms of historical value and examine the context of their production. The primary sources that we are going to examine are Antonio Pigafita's First Voyage Around the World, Emilio Jacinto's Kartilya ng Katipunan, the 1898 Declaration of Philippine Independence, the political cartoon, Alfred McCoy's Philippine Cartoons, political caricature of the American era, 1900s to 1941, and Corazon Aquino's speech before the U.S. Congress. These primary sources range from chronicles, official documents, speeches, and cartoons to visual arts. Needless to say, different types of sources necessitate different kinds of analysis and contain different levels of importance. We are going to explore that in this chapter. And for the first topic of this chapter, we are going to analyze and discuss a brief summary of the First Voyage Around the World by Magellan by Antonio Pigafita. This book was taken from the chronicles of contemporary voyagers and navigators of the 16th century. Antonio Pigafita, an Italian nobleman who accompanied Ferdinand Magellan in his fateful circumnavigation of the world. His work instantly became a classic that prominent literary men in the West like William Shakespeare, Michael de Montaigne, and Giambattista Vico referred to the book in their interpretation of the New World. His travelogue is one of the most important primary sources in the study of the pre-colonial Philippines. His account was also a major reference to the events leading to Magellan's arrival in the Philippines. his encounter with local leaders, his death at the hands of Lapu-Lapu's forces in the Battle of Mactan, and the departure of what was left of Magellan's fleet from the islands. Locating his accounts in that context of its writing warrants a familiarity with the dominant frame of mind in the age of exploration, which pervaded Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. Students of history need to realize that primary sources used in the subsequent written histories depart from a certain perspectives. And his account was written from his perspective and was a product of the context of its production. The first voyage around the world by Magellan was published after Pigafita returned to Italy. Examining the document reveals several insights not just into the character of the Philippines during the pre-colonial period, but also into how the fresh eyes of the Europeans regarded a deeply unfamiliar terrain, environment, people, and culture. For this chapter, we will focus on the chronicles of Antonio Pigafita as he wrote his first-hand observation and general impression for the Far East, including their experience in the Visayas. In Pigofetas' account, their feet reached what he called the Landronis Islands or Islands of the Thief. Para sa unang topic ng chapter 2, tinatalakay nito ang Chronicles of Antonio Pigafita. Si Antonio Pigafita ang kasama ni Ferdinand Magellan sa paglibot ng mundo. Dito ay tatalakayin ang naging obserbasyon at karanasan nila noong magpunta sila sa Landronis Island o tinatawag na Islands of the Thieves. Ayon kay Antonio Pigafita, these people have no arms but use sticks which have a fishbone at the end. They are poor but ingenious and great thieves, and for the sake of that we call these three islands the Landronis Islands. Ngayon, ang Landronis Island ay tinatawag na Marianas Island. And Marianas Islands are located south-southeast of Japan, west-southwest of Hawaii, north of New Guinea, and east of the Philippines. And after 10 days, ayon kay Pigafita, narating nila ang isla na tinatawag na Samal na ngayon ay Samar. Ngunit napagdesisyonan ni Magellan na sa ibang isla na lang sila magpalipas ng ilang araw at magpahinga. Ayon kay Pigafita, matapos ang 2 araw, March 18, siyam na kalalakihan ang nagtungo sa kanila. They welcomed them with foods, drinks, and gifts, at bilang kapalit, the native gave them fish, palm, wine or oraka, pigs, and 2 kochos, as well as rice or omay, cocos, and other food supplies. Pigafita detailed in amazement and fascination the palm tree which bore fruits called kocho and wine. Ayon din sa kanya, ito ay mukhang niyog. Ayon kay Pigafita, this palm produces a fruit named kocho, which is as large as the head or tearbouts. Its first husk is green and 2 fingers in thickness. In its they find certain threads with which they make the cords from fastening their boats. Under this husk there is another very hard and thicker than that of a walnut. They burn this second rind and make with it a powder that is useful to them. Under this rind there is a white marrow of a finger's thickness, which they eat fresh with meat and fish, as we do bread, and it has the taste of an almond. And if any one dried it, he might make a bread of it. Pigafita characterized the people as very familiar and friendly, and willingly showed them different islands and the names of these islands. The fleet went to Homono Islands or Homonhon, and there they found what Pigafita referred to as the watering place of good signs. It is in this place where Pigafita wrote that they found the first signs of gold on the islands. They named the island, with the nearby islands, the archipelago of Santa Lazarus. They left the island. Then on March 25th, Pigafita recounted that they saw two balanghay or balangay, a longboat full of people in Mazawa. The leader, who Pigafita referred to as the king of the balangay or balangay, sent his men to the ship Magellan. The Europeans entertained these men and gave them gifts. When the king of the balangay offered to give Magellan a bar of gold and chest of ginger, Magellan declined. Magellan sent the interpreter to the king and asked for money for the needs of his ships and expressed that he came into the island as a friend and not as an enemy. The king responded by giving Magellan the needed provisions of food in China, where Magellan exchanged gifts of robes in Turkish fashion, red cap, and gave the people knives and mirrors. The two then expressed their desire to become brothers. Magellan also boasted of his men in armor who could not be struck with swords and daggers. The king was fascinated and remarked that men in such armor could be worth 100 of his men. Magellan further showed the king his other weapons, helmets, and artilleries. Magellan also shared with the king his charts and maps and shared how they found the islands. After a few days, Magellan was introduced to the king's brother, who was also a king of another island. They saw a mines of gold. According to Pigafita, they saw a mines of gold. The gold was abundant at the parts of the ship, and the house of the second king were made of gold. According to him, this king is the most handsome of the men that he saw to the place. Namangha din daw si Pigafita sa silk and gold na ginawang accessories and golden dagger na dala-dala ng hari kasama ang wooden polished seat. Ang hari ay si Raha Kalambu, king of Saluan and Kalagan or Butuan and Caragua, and Ray Istago is the first king. On March 31, Easter Sunday, Magellan ordered the chaplain to preside a mass by the shore. And nung malaman ng hari na may misa sa tabing dagat, nagpadala ito ng 2 patay na baboy at dumalo rin sa misa kasama ang iba pang hari. According to Pigafita, when the offertory of the mass came, the two kings went to kiss the cross like us, but they offered nothing, and that the elevation of the body of our Lord they were kneeling like us, and adored our Lord with joined hands. After the mass, Magellan ordered that the cross be brought with the nails and crowns in place. Magellan explained that the cross, the nail, and the crown were the signs of his emperor, and that he was ordered to plant it in the places that he would reach. Magellan further explained that the cross would be beneficial for their people because once the Spaniards saw this cross, then they would know that they had been in this land and would not cause them troubles, and any person who might be held captives by them would be released. The king concurred and allowed for the cross to be planted. This mass would go down in history as the first mass in the Philippines, and the cross would be famed by Magellan's cross is still preserved at the present day. After 7 days, Magellan and his men decided to move and look for islands where they could acquire more supplies and provisions. Ceylon or Leyte, Bohol, and Surubu or Cebu, and intended to go there. Raiya Kalamba offered to pilot them in going to Cebu, the largest and the richest of the island. On April 7th of the same year, Magellan and his men reached the part of Cebu. The king of Cebu, through Magellan's interpreter, demanded that they pay tribute as it was customary. but Magellan refused. Magellan said that he was a captain of a king himself and thus would not pay tribute to other kings. Magellan's interpreter explained to the king of Cebu that Magellan's king was the emperor of the great empire and that it would do them better to make friends with them than to forge an enmity. The king of Cebu consulted his council. By the next day, Magellan's men and the king of Cebu, together with the principal men of Cebu, met in an open space. There the king offered a bit of his blood and demanded that Magellan do the same. Pigafita recounted, then the king said that he was content, and as a greater sign of affection, but be sent him a little of his blood from his right arm and wish he should do the like. Our people answered that he would do it. Besides that, he said that all the captains who came to his country had been accustomed to make a present to him, and he to them, and therefore they should ask their captain if he would observe the custom. Our people answered that he would. But as the king wished to keep up the custom, let him begin and make a present, and then the captain would do his duty. The following day, Magellan spoke before the people of Cebu about peace and God. Pigafita reported that the people took pleasure in Magellan's speech. Magellan then asked the people who would succeed the king after his reign, and the people responded that the eldest child of the king, who happened to be a daughter, would be the next in line. Pigafita also related how the people talk about bow at the old age. Parents were no longer taken into account and has to follow the orders of their children as the new leaders of the land. Magellan responded to this by saying that his faith entailed children to render honor and obedience to their parents. Magellan preached about their faith further, and people were reportedly convinced. Pigafita wrote that their men were overjoyed seeing that the people wished to become Christians through their free will and not because they were forced or intimidated. On the 14th of April, the people gathered with the king and the other principal men of the islands. Magellan spoke to the king and encouraged him to be a good Christian by burning all of the idols and worship the cross instead. The king of Cebu was then baptized as a Christian. Pigafita wrote, to that the king and all his people answered that they would obey the commands of the captain and do all that he told them. The captain took the king by the hand, and they walked about on the scaffolding, and when he was baptized, he said that he would name him Don Charles or Carlos, as the emperor his sovereign was named, and he named the prince Don Ferdinandis after the brother of the emperor, and the king of Masaba, Jehan. To the Moor he gave the name of Christopher, and to the others each name of his fancy. After 9 days, Pigafita counted that all of the island's inhabitants were already baptized. He admitted that they burned a village down for obeying neither the king nor Magellan. The mass was conducted by the shore every day. When the queen came to the mass one day, Magellan gave her an image of an infant, Jesus, made by Pigafita himself. The king of Cebu swore that he would always be faithful to Magellan. When Magellan reiterated that all of the newly baptized Christians need to burn their idols, but the natives gave excuses telling Magellan that they needed the dole to heal a sick man who was a relative to the king. Magellan insisted that they should instead put their faith in Jesus Christ. They went to the sick man and baptized him. After a baptismal, Pigafita recorded that the man was able to speak again. He called this a miracle. And on the 26th of April, Zula, a principal man from the island of Mactan, went to see Magellan and asked him for a boat full of men so that he would be able to fight the chief named Lapu-Lapu or Lapu-Lapu. Such chief, according to Zula, refused to obey the king and was also preventing him from doing so. Magellan offered 3 boats instead and expressed his desire to go to Mactan himself to fight the said chief. Magellan's forces arrives in Mactan in daylight. They numbered 49 in total, and the islanders of Mactan were estimated to number 1,500, and the battle began. According to Pigafita, when we reached land, we found the islanders 1,500 in number, drawn up in 3 squadrons, came down upon us with terrible shouts, 2 squadrons attacking us on the flanks, and the 3rd in front. The captain then divided his men in 2 bands. Our musketeers and crossbowmen fired for half an hour from a distance, but did nothing, since the bullets and arrows they passed through their shields made of tin wood, and perhaps wounded their arms, yet did not stop them. The captain shouted not to fire, but he was not listened to. The islanders seeing that the shots of our guns did them little or no harm would not retire, but shouted more loudly, and springing from one side to other to avoid our shots. They at the same time drew nearer to us, throwing arrows, javelins, spears, hardened and fire, atones, and even mud, so that we could hardly defend ourselves. Some of them cast lances pointed with arrow at the Captain General. Magellan died in that battle. The natives, perceiving that the bodies of the enemies were protected with armors, aimed for their legs instead. Magellan was pierced with a poisoned arrow in his right leg. A few of their men charged at the natives and tried to intimidate them by burning an entire village, but this only enraged the natives further. Magellan was specifically targeted because the natives knew that he was the Captain General. Magellan was hit with a lance in the face. Magellan retaliated and pierced the same native with his lance in the breast and tried to draw his sword but could not lift it because of his wounded arm. Seeing that the captain has already deteriorated, more natives came to attack him. One native with a great sword delivered a blow in Magellan's left leg, brought him face down, and the natives ceaselessly attacked Magellan with lances, swords, and even with their bare hands. Pigofita recounted the last moments of Magellan, whilst the Indians were thus overpowering him. Several times he turned round towards us to see if we were all in safety, as though his obstinate fight no other object than give an opportunity for the retreat of his men. Pigafita also said that the king of Cebu, who was baptized, could have went help, but Magellan instructed him not to join the battle and stay in the balangay, so that he would see how they fought. The king offered the people of Mactan gifts of any value and amount in exchange of Magellan's body, but the chief refused. They wanted to keep Magellan's body as a memento of their victory. Magellan's men elected Duarte Barbosa as the new captain. Pigafita also told how Magellan's slave, an interpreter named Henry, betrayed them and told the king of Cebu that they intended to leave as quickly as possible. Pigafita alleged that slave told the king that if he followed the slave's advice, then the king could acquire the ships and the goods of Magellan's fleet. The two conspired and betrayed what was left of Magellan's men. The king invited these men to a gathering where he said he would present the jewels that he would send for the king of Spain. Pigafita was not able to join the 24 men who attended because he was nursing his battle wounds. It was only a short time when they heard cries and lamentations. The natives had slain all of the men except the interpreter and Juan Serrano, who was already wounded. Serrano was presented and shouted at the men in the ship, asking them to pay ransom so he would be spared. However, they refused and would not allow anyone to go to the shore. The fleet departed and abandoned Serrano. They left Cebu and continued their journey around the world.
I did the My topic is analysis of Pigafita's Chronicle. So first, sino muna si Pigafita? Siya ay nangalan o mas kilalang Antonio Pigafita. Si Antonio Pigafita ay isang Italian scholar and explorer. Siya sa mga kasamahan ni Ferdinand Magellan na umikot sa mundo. Tapos, siya sa mga nag-assist o gumawa ng journal about sa mga lokal na lingwa dito sa Pilipinas. Example, ito yung Cebuano. Isa sila sa mga nag-translate or gumawa ng mga journal na pag-translate ng iba't ibang local language dito sa Pilipinas. So, start sa ating mismong topic, analysis of Pigafita's Chronicle. The Chronicle of Pigafita was one of the most cited documents by the historians who wish to study the pre-colonial Philippines. As one of the earliest written accounts, Pigafita was seen as a credible source for a period which was prior and undocumented. Moreover, being the earliest detailed documentation, it was believed that Pigafetas writings account for the purest pre-colonial society. Indeed, Pigafetas' work is of the great importance in the study and writing of Filipino history. Nevertheless, there needs to have a more nuanced reading of the source within that contextual backdrop. A student of history should recognize certain biases accompanying the author of this identity, loyalties, and the circumstances that he was in and how it affected the text that he produced. In the case of Pigafetta, the reader needs to understand that he was a chronicle commissioned by the King of Spain to accompany and document a voyage intended to expand the Spanish Empire. He was also of noble descent who came from a rich family in Italy. These attributes influence his narrative, his selection of details to be included in the text, his characterization of people and of the species that he encountered, and his interpretation and retelling of the events. Being a scholar of cartography and geography, Pigafetta was able to give detail on geography and climate of the places that their voyage had reached. So, ito si Antonio Pigafita, isa sa mga sikat na historian or writer about sa Philippine history. Yung kanyang mga gawa ay kinikilala ng mga historian. Then, in reading Pigafetta's description of the people, one has to keep in mind that he was coming from a 60th century European perspective. The reader might notice how Pigafetta, whether implicitly or explicitly, regarded the indigenous belief system and way of life as inferior to that of Christianity and of the Europeans. He would always remark on the nakedness of the natives or how he fascinated by their exotic culture. Pigafetta also noticeably emphasized the natives' amazement and illiteracy, the European artillery, merchandise, and other goods. In the same way that Pigafetta repeatedly mentioned the abundance of spices like ginger and of precious metals like gold. His observation and assessment of the indigenous culture employed the European standards. Hence, when they saw the indigenous attires of the natives, Pigafetta saw them as being naked. Pigafetta saw them as being naked because from the European standpoint, they were wearing fewer clothes in them. Pigafetta's perspective was too narrow to realize that such attire was only appropriate to the tropical climate of the island. The same was true for materials that the natives and used for their houses like palm and bamboo. Those materials would let more more air come through the house and compensate for the hot climate in the island. So ito nga po si Antonio Pigafetta ay um, napakalaking ambag sa pag-aaral ng ating mga katutubong tao dito sa Pilipinas. Sinabi nga dito na nainganyo siya sa pag-aaral ng ating mga katutubo, paano yung kanilang kasuotan, pamamahay, or mga iba't ibang pagkakaiba nila sa normal na tao.
Kataas-taasan, kagalang-galangang katipunan ng mga anak ng bayan or KKK or katipunan, arguably the most important organization formed in the Philippine history. Even though many anti-colonial movements, efforts, and organizations had already been established, it was the only organization that envisioned a united Filipino nation that would revolt against Spaniards for total independence of the country. An example is Diego Silang, who was an Ilocano who took up his arms and led one of the longest running revolts in the country, but he was mainly concerned for his locality, and he also referred to himself as El Rey de Ilocos or the King of Ilocos, while the propaganda movements led by illustrator like Marcelo H. del Pilar, Graciano Lopez, Jena, and Jose Rizal did not envision a total separation from Spain but only demanded equal rights, representation, and protection from the abuses of prayers. Ang KKK ang isa sa pinaka-importanteng organisasyon nangyari sa Philippine history dahil ang organisasyong ito ay naghihimok na mag-alyansa laban sa mga Espanyol. Ang kanilang goal ay magkaroon ng total independence ang ating bansa. Hindi katulad ng mga propaganda na isinagawa ni na Marcelo H. del Pilar, Graciano Lopez at Jose Rizal. Ang mga propagandang ito ay nagdulot lamang ng separation, hindi nagdulot ng total separation sa Spain, ngunit nagdemand ng mga equal rights and protection from abuses. Samantalang ang KKK ay naglalayong maging independent or kumalas na sa mga Espanyol. Mga aral ng katipunan ng mga A&B or lessons of the organizations of the Sons of Country was the original title of Kartilya ng Katipunan, the most important Katipunan documents. This is written by Emilio Jacinto in 1896. He was 18 years old when he joined the movement, a law student at University de Santo Tomas. Despite his youth, Bonifacio recognizes the value and intellect of Jacinto, that upon seeing that Jacinto's Kartilya was much better than the Decalogue he wrote, he willingly favored that the cartilla be distributed to their fellow Katipuneros. Jacinto became secretary of the organization and took charge of the short-lived printing press of the Katipunan on 15th of April 1897. Bonifacio appointed Jacinto as an commander of the Katipunan. As Northern Luzon, Jacinto was 22 years old. He died of malaria at young age of 24 in town of Magdalena, Laguna. Cartilla is treated as Katipunan's rule of conduct. It has 14 rules that instruct the way a Katipunero should behave. Cartilla's rules are classified into two. The first makes the members as an upright individual, while the second contains the rules that will guide the way he treats his fellow men. These are the translated version of the rules in Cartilla. The first rule is, the life that is not consecrated to a lofty and reasonable purpose is a tree without a shade, if not a poisonous weed. Number 2. To do good for personal gain and not for its own sake is not a virtue. 3. It is rational to be charitable and love one's fellow creature and adjust one's conduct, acts, and words to what is in itself reasonable. 4. Whether our skin be black or white, we are all born equal. Superiority in knowledge, wealth, and beauty are to be understood, but not superior by nature. 5. The honorable man prefers honor to personal gain. The scoundrel gain to honor. Number 6. The honorable man, his word is sacred. 7. Do not waste thy time. Wealth can be recovered but not time lost. 8. Defend the oppressed and fight the oppressor before the law or in the field. 9. The prudent man is sparing in words and faithful in keeping secrets. 10. On the therapy path of life, man is the guide of woman and the children, and if the guide leads to the precipice, those who guides will also go there. 11. Thou must not look upon woman as a mere plaything, but as a faithful companion who will share with the penalties of life. Her physical weakness will increase the interest in her, and she will remind the mother who bore this and reared thee. 12. What thou dost not desire done unto wife, children, brothers, and sisters, that do not unto the wife, children, brothers, and sisters, as they neighbors. Number 13. Man is not worth more because he is a king, because his nose is aquiline, and his color white, not because he is a priest, a servant of God, nor because of high prerogative that he enjoys upon earth, but he is worth most who is a man of proven and real value, who does good, keeps his words worthy and honest, he who does not oppress nor consent to being oppressed, he who loves and cherishes his fatherland, though he be born in the wilderness and know no tongue but his own. And lastly, number 14. When these rules of conduct shall be known to all, the longed for the sun of liberty shall rise brilliant over this most unhappy portion of the globe, and its rays shall diffuse everlasting joy among the confederated brethren of the same race. The lives of those who have gone before, the fatigues and the well-paid sufferings will remain if he who desires to enter has informed himself of all this and believes he will be able to perform what will be his duties. He may fill out the application for admission. As the primary governing document which determines the rules of conduct in the Katipunan, properly understanding the Cartilla will thus help in understanding the values, ideas, aspirations, and even ideology of the organization. The content and the provisions of the Cartilla as a reaction and response to certain value systems that they found despicable in the present state of things that they struggled against with. For example, the 4th and the 13th rules in the Cartilla are an invocation of the inherent equality between the among men regardless of race, occupation, or status in a context of the Spanish colonial era, where the Indios were treated as the inferior of the white Europeans. The Katipunan saw to it that the alternative order that they wished to promulgate through the revolution necessarily destroyed this kind of unjust hierarchy, and we can analyze the values upheld in the document of consistent with the foregoing rationality and liberal ideas in the 18th and 19th century. Equality, tolerance, freedom, and liberty were values that first emerged in the 18th century. And aside from the liberal values that can be dissected in the document, we can also disappear certain Victorian and chivalrous values in the text. For example, various provisions in the Cartilla repeatedly emphasize the importance of honor in words and in action. The teaching of the Katipunan on how women should be treated with honor and respect, while positive in many respects and certainly a significant stride from the practice of raping and physical abusing women, can still be telling of the Katipunan's secondary regard for women in relation to men. For example, in the 10th rule, the document specifically stated that men should be the guide of women and children, and that he should set a good example, otherwise the women and the children would be guided in the path of evil. Nevertheless, the same document stated that women should be treated as companions by men and not playtimes that can be exploited for their pleasure. Even though the Katipunan can be criticized because of these provisions, however, one must not forget the context where the organization was born. Not even in Europe or in the whole of the West, at that juncture, recognized the problem of gender inequality indeed. It can be argued that Katipunan's recognition of women, an important partner in the struggle, as reflected not just in Cartilla but also in the organizational structure of the fraternity where a women's unit was established, is an endeavor advanced for its time. Aside from Rizal's known letter to the women of Malolos, no same effort by the supposed cosmopolitan propaganda movement was achieved until the movement's eventual disintegration in the later part of 18. The Cartilla was instructive not just of the Katipunan's conduct toward other people, but also for the members' development as individuals in their rights. Generally speaking, the rules in the Cartilla can be classified as either directed to how one should treat his neighbors or to how one should develop the conduct oneself, both and essential to the success and fulfillment of the Katipunan's ideas. For example, Cartilla's teachings on honoring one's words and not wasting time are teaching directed towards self-development, while the rules on treating the neighbor's wife, children, and brothers the way that you want yours to be treated is instruction on how Katipuneros should treat and regard their neighbors. All in all, a proper reading of the Cartilla will reveal a more thorough understanding of the Katipunan and the significant role that it played in the revolution and the unfolding of the Philippine history as we know it. The document on the Declaration of Independence can reveal some often overlooked historical truths about this important event in Philippine history. Aside from this, the document reflects the general revolutionary sentiment of that period. For example, the abuses specifically mentioned in the proclamation, like prayer abuse, racial discrimination, and inequality before the law, reflect the most compelling mental represented by the revolutionary leadership. However, no mention was made about the more serious problem that affected the miners more profoundly. The land and agrarian crisis is felt by the numerous Filipino peasants in the 19th century. This is ironic, especially when renowned Philippine Revolution historian Teodoro Agoncillo stated that the Philippine Revolution was an agrarian revolution. The common revolutionary soldiers fought in the revolution for the hope of owning the lands that they were tilling once the freer states in different provinces like Batangas and Laguna dissolved. If when the revolution succeeded, such aspects are realities of the revolutionary struggle were either unfamiliar to the middle-class revolutionary leaders like Emilio Aguinaldo, Ambrosio Rianzares Bautista, and Felipe Buencamino, or the intentionally left out because they were landholders themselves. The proclamation also gives us the impression on how the victorious revolutionary government of Aguinaldo historicized the struggle for independence. There were mentions of past events that were seen important turning points of the movement against Spain. The execution of the Gamborza, for example, and the failed Cavite mutiny of 1872 was narrated in detail. This shows that they saw this event as a significant awakening of the Filipinos in the real conditions of the nation under Spain. Jose Rizal's legacy and martyrdom was also mentioned in the document. However, the Katipunan as the pioneer of revolutionary movement was only mentioned once toward the end of the document. There was no mention of the Katipunan's foundation. Bonifacio and his co-founders were also left out. It can be argued thus that the way of historical narration found in the document also reflects the politics of the victors. The enmity between Aguinaldo's Magdalo and Bonifacio's Magdiwang in the Katipunan is no secret in the pages of our history. On the contrary, the war-led Aguinaldo's men with the forces of the United States were discussed in detail. The point is, even official records and documents like the Proclamation of Independence, while truthful most of the time, still exude the politics and biases of whoever is in power. This manifests in the selectiveness of information that can be found in these records. It is the task of the historian thus to analyze the content of this document in relation to the dominant politics and the context of Philippine people and institution surroundings. This tells us a lesson on taking primary sources like official government records within the circumstance of production. Studying one historical subject thus entails looking at multiple primary sources and pieces of historical evidence in order to have more nuanced and contextual analysis of our past.
A glance at selected Philippine political caricature in Alfred McCoy's Philippine Cartoons, Political Caricature of the American Era. Political cartoons and caricature are a rather recent art form which were away from the classical art by exaggerating human feature and poking fun at its subjects such as art genre and techniques become a part of a print media as a form of social and political commentary which usually targets a persona of a power and authority. Cartoons become an effective tool of publicizing opinion through heavy use of symbolism, which is a different from a verbose, written editorial and opinion pieces. The unique way that a caricature represents opinion and captures the audience imagination is reason enough for historians to examine the political cartoons.
Commentaries in mass media inevitably shape public opinion, and such kind of opinion is worthy of historical examination.
In his book, Philippine Cartoons, Political Caricature of the American Era, 19,000 to 1941, Alfred McCoy together with Alfredo Roses compiled the political cartoons published in newspaper, dailies, and periodicals in a aforementioned time period. For a part, we're going to look at selected cartoons and explain the text for each one. The first example, shown above, was published in The Independent on May 20, 1916. The cartoon shows a politician from Tondo named Dr. Santos passing his crown to his brother-in-law, Dr. Barcelona, a Filipino guy, as depicted wearing salakot and barong Tagalog, was trying to stop Santos, telling the latter to stop giving Barcelona the crown because it is not his to begin with. The second cartoon was also published by The Independent on 16 June 1917. This was drawn by Fernando Bersolo and was aimed as a commentary to the working of Manila Police. At a period, here we see a Filipino child who stole a skinny chicken because he had nothing to eat. The police officer was relentlessly pursuing the said child. A man wearing a salakot labeled Juan de la Cruz was grabbing the officer, telling him, "You leave the small-time pickpockets and thieves, and to turn at the great thieves instead." He was appointing to halt warehouses containing boxes of rice, milk, and grocery products. The third cartoon was a commentary on the unprecedented cases of color-room automobiles in the city street. The Philippine Free Press publishes a commentary when fatal accidents involving color-room vehicles and taxi occurred too often already. These four cartoons depicts a cinema. A blow-up police officer was at the screen saying that couples are not allowed to neck and make love in the theater. Two youngsters looked horrified while an older couple vented abuse. The next cartoon was published by The Independent on 27 November 1915. Here we see the caricature of Uncle Sam riding a chariot pulled by Filipinos wearing school uniforms. The Filipino boys were carrying American objects like baseball bats, whiskey, and boxing gloves. McCoy, in this caption to the said cartoon, says that his cartoon was based on an event in 1907 when William Howard Taft was brought to the Manila Pier riding a chariot pulled by students of Liceo de Manila. Such was condemned by the nationalists at the time. The last cartoon was published by Lapang Calabao on 24 August 1907. In the picture, we can see Uncle Sam taking porridge to the politicians and members of the Progresista Party, sometimes known as a Federaluna Party, while members of the Nacionalista Party look on a wait for their turn. This cartoon depicts the patronage of the United States being coveted by politicians from either of the party.
Analysis of political caricature during the American period. The transition from the Spanish colonial period to the American occupation period demonstrated different strands of changes in shift in culture, society, and politics. The American drastically introduced democracy to the ancient nations, and consequences were far from the ideal. Aside from this, it was also during the American period that Filipinos were introduced to different manifestation of modernity like healthcare, modern transportation, and media. Sinabi dito na ang napakalaking pagbabago sa kultura, sa society and politics ng American period kumpara noong Spanish colonial period. Sa American period, pinakilala dito yung pagkakaroon ng modernity sa ating example, healthcare, sa transportation and sa media. The post-independence and the post-Filipino American period in the Philippines were experienced differently by Filipinos coming from different classes. The upper Principalia class experienced economic prosperity with the opening up of the Philippine economy to the United States, but the majority of the poor Filipino remained poor, desperate, and victims of state depression. The selected cartoons illustrate not only the option of uh, certain media, Uh, the selected cartoons illustrate not only the opinion of certain media outfits about the Philippine society during the American period, but also paint a broad image of society and politics under the United States. In the arena of politics, for example, we see the price that Filipinos paid for the democracy modeled after the American. First, it seems that the Filipino politicians at that time did not understand well enough the essence of democracy, the accompanying democratic institution and process. This can be seen in the rising dynastic politics in Tondo, as depicted in the cartoon published by the independent patronage also became influential and powerful, not only between clients and patrons but also between the newly formed political parties composed of the elite and the This was depicted in the cartoon where the United States, represented by Uncle Sam, divided dole out of members of Federalista while the Nacionalista politicians looked on and waited for their time. Thus, the essence of completing political parties to enforce choices among the voters was cancelled out. The problem continues up to present where politicians transfer from one party to another depending on which party was powerful in a specific period of time. Ah, dito sa time na American mas na-introduce dito yung pagkakaroon ng mas malaking epekto yung sila sa politics. Especially, example po nila dito yung pagkakaroon ng mga party or kung saan kasalukuyan yung mga party list. Sinabi dito, nagkakaroon ng problema. Example, yung paglilipat-lipat ng party ng isang politician depende kung sino yung mas malakas o mas powerful. Basta po sa part na to, no American period, mas malaki yung impact nila sa politics sa ating bansa.
Okay, our next topic is about revisiting Aquino's speech before the US Congress. So, bago natin puntahan ang ating main topic about sa documentation of speech niya, let's have a background on our 11th President, Cory Aquino. Okay, so alam naman natin lahat na si Corazon Aquino was the widowed wife of Benigno Aquino Jr. that was assassinated on August 21, 1983. Is the strongest opposition of late President Ferdinand Marcos. So, kaya si Cory was portrayed in the history as the mourning wife of his husband. Pa dito, si Corazon ay walang experience with politics unlike on former Senator Benigno Aquino. Then, Cory Aquino was functioned as the symbol of the restoration of democracy and overthrow the Marcos dictatorship in 1980. Another thing, Corazon is galing siya sa mayamang pamilya na Cuanco family from Tarlac na who owns Hacienda Luisita. They owned a vast portion of lands of sugar plantation and their relatives occupy local and national government positions. So, kung i-compare natin siya kay Ferdinand Marcos, he is well-rounded about politics although her husband was in the politics before he's assassinated. Isa sa advocacy ni Cory is to fight dictatorship. Marcos, yun nga. So that yan ang naging rason niya upang tumakbo bilang presidente ng Pilipinas. After that, snap election was happened on February 1986, but si Cory ay natalo. Though they were claiming that na meron daw daya na nangyari, on the other side ay hindi ko talaga gusto o alam ang totoo based on my research, not just because nabibi mo. Okay, let's back on the topic. After that snap election, sobrang daming protesta na nangyari. Kabilang na dito ang ilan sa mga rebelde like CCNPA to make this revolution work. Sa kabilang tao naman, si Jaime Cardinal Sin na isang Archbishop ng Manila ay hinikayat niya yung mga tao upang sumama sa People Power Revolution. That's why noong 1986, napakalaking contribution ng simbahan kasi it gives a lot of power for assuming her presidency. Okay, so that's all for the short background information about Corazon Aquino. So, let's tackle the speech or main topic. So, the speech was delivered on US Congress or the US people on September 18, 1986. That was 7 months after Corazon Aquino became the president of the Philippines. And Corazon actually emphasized the character and conviction of her late husband, Ninoy Aquino. And she was talking about the strong opposition of Ninoy. So, ilang times niya sinabi na that they have lost Ninoy Aquino and lahat ng sufferings na experience niya in the hands of Marcos. So, matatakil natin yan mamaya. So to make it clear about their speech, I downloaded the cutted actual footage of the speech on the US Congress.
The government sought to break him by indignities and terror. They locked him up in a tiny, nearly airless cell in a military camp in the north. They stripped him naked and held the threat of a sudden midnight execution over his head. Ninoy held up manfully under all of it. I barely did as well. For 43 days, the authorities would not tell me what had happened to him.
Sinasabi dito na during the presidency ni Marcos na they give a lot of terror to the people, although she's talking for us, banda nilak daw sila sa tiny room and quite airless na bootcamp ng military sa north. Sinasabi niya na they strip him naked at mayroon pang pagbanta na nangyari, that midnight execution. Ayon sa kanya, ang mga otoridad daw ay walang sinabi patungkol sa kanyang asawa. Said that this was the first time my children and I felt we had lost him.
The government sought to break him by indignity, and then we lost him irrevocably and more painfully than in the past. The news came to us in Boston. It had to be after the 3 happiest years of our lives together. But his death was my country's resurrection in the courage and faith by which alone they could be free again. The dictator had called him a nobody, yet 2 million people threw aside their passivity and fear and escorted him to his.
Based on the speech, makikita natin na minanage niya yung EDSA revolution para maging peaceful para sa kanyang pagkamatay ng kanyang asawa. Madaming tao noon ang nasa side nila. Parang sinasabi niya na kung hindi namatay si Ninoy, walang EDSA na magaganap. Maraming tao noon ang may gusto ng peaceful. Then freedom for rights, and they are against on Marcos dictatorship.
I held fast to Ninoy's conviction that it must be by the ways of democracy. I held out for participation in the 1984 election the dictatorship called, even if I knew it would be rigged. I was warned by the lawyers of the opposition that I ran the grave risk of legitimizing the foregone results of elections that were clearly going to be fraudulent. But I was not fighting for lawyers, but for the people, in whose intelligence I had implicit faith. By the exercise of democracy, even in a dictatorship, they would be prepared for democracy when it came. And then also, it was the only way I knew by which we could measure our power, even in the terms dictated by the dictatorship. The people vindicated me in an election shamefully marked by government thuggery and fraud. The opposition swept the elections, garnering a clear majority of the votes, even if they ended up, thanks to a corrupt Commission on Elections, with barely a third of the seats in Parliament. Now I'm
Based dito, pinapalabas niya na ang result ng eleksyon na kagaya ng sinabi ko kanina ay isang dayan between her and Marcos. Maybe this is proved because kulang tayo sa evidence. So sabi niya, I held fast to Ninoy's conviction that is must be by the ways of democracy. I held out for the participation in 1984 election that dictatorship called, even if I knew it would be rigged. Alam naman natin na what really made her become a president because she assumed by the power of EDSA People Power Revolution. Sabi niya. But it was not fighting for lawyers but for the people in whose intelligence I had implicit faith by the exercise of democracy even in the dictatorship. They would be prepared for the democracy when it came. So, ang major talaga ni Nicolas Aquino is the restoration of democracy. The restoration of rights, mainly o sa peace. Narinig nyo naman siguro na nag-declare ng martial law noon dahil sa mga rebels. And noong EDSA People Power, nandun ang mga rebels because of Corazon wanted the peace. Now, I ask you guys, now Corazon Aquino was declared as a president. Diba? She wanted a peaceful country with the rebels on CCNPA. She wanted a freedom of rights. Look at now, bakit meron pa ding mga rebels na nabubuo? A lot of terrorism, then rebellions. Hindi ko na babain tong presentation na to kasi nasabi ko na yung main reason talaga ni Corazon Aquino kung bakit siya tumakbo bilang presidente. In one word, democracy talaga ang tinatarget niya. So, also, pumunta siya sa US to make a speech to US people governments para maging kaalyado natin sila hanggang sa susunod na mga presidente. After that, Cory ended her speech by thanking America for serving as home to her family for what she referred to as the 3 happiest years for our lives together. She enjoys America in building the Philippines as a new home for democracy and in turning the country as a most shining testament for our two nations' commitment to freedom. So, this presentation give us clue and knowledge para mas maintindihan natin maayos yung nakaraang pamamalakad. Hope you learned something. Thank you.